Story 1. Matt Damon. I had 15 minutes to interview him, and we spent 14.5 minutes talking about the Red Sox. He is a very nice and friendly person. Story 2. Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn played hockey with their son. I understand that Wyatt is also an actor, but at the time we were 15 years old and he was not yet famous. Story 3. During a show I was performing in, I remember looking out at the audience and seeing a little white-haired old man. I thought, that looks like Danny DeVito. Wouldn't that be ridiculous? Then the director came to the dressing rooms after the show and said, not to alarm you, but Danny DeVito is outside waiting to congratulate you. And it was him. He was filming Dumbo. And someone connected to the movie knew one of our cast members and had brought him along to our show. He was very nice. He shook everyone's hands, asked lots of questions, and was genuinely lovely to all of us. I also literally walked into Jim Broadbent once. He was paying for parking at a meter, and I was too busy chatting with my friend walking alongside me to notice where I was going and accidentally bumped into him. To be polite about the situation, neither of us could stop apologizing to the other, even though it was clearly my fault. Story 4. I met Bill Murray twice 2 years apart. I was working at a shoe store and helped him. When he came into the store the second time, he ran around shouting my name and looking for me. Story 5. Dave Chappelle came to my birthday and sat next to me with his wife and 2 kids in a restaurant that had about 12 seats total. I really wanted a photo but didn't want to disturb his family time. Story 6. I visited a high school friend in Tokyo, and her grandmother was friends with Hayao Miyazaki's wife. He is a very serious person. Story 7. I sat across the aisle from LL Cool J on a Southwest flight. It was so long ago that someone in his entourage carried on board a duffel bag full of alkaline batteries for the group's music players. Story 8. I am older than a rock, so I am not sure who I have met that anyone these days recognizes unless they are old like myself. 74. Here is the list of those I have met that maybe someone recognizes. President Gerald Ford, the Shah of Iran, Elvis Presley, Minnesota Governor Arne Carlson, Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura, before he was governor, Texas Governor John Connolly, Carol Burnett, Selena, the Tejano singer, Warren Moon, the National Football League quarterback. Many people may not know anything about anyone on that list, and I do not know who someone else would consider the most famous. Story 9. Prince came into my office and ordered some soup while glaring at me as I washed the dishes, presumably because I was disturbing his meal. Story 10. George Takei, at a Star Trek convention signing autographs, was gracious and kind to everyone, even after hours of signing. By the time I approached him, his signature was absolutely beautiful, and he took an extra minute to personalize it. To my name, my best, George Takei. What a gem of a person. Story 11. I work in the industry and have met many famous people, but I have to say that despite not being a particular fan of hers, the most famous person I have met is Celine Dion. However, I will say that if you have seen her live, what a voice! Even if her music isn't your taste, her talent is undeniable. Story 12. I worked in professional executive security for several years. Prince was a kind man and surprisingly funny. He could glide up and down stairs in 6-inch high-heeled boots like a ballet dancer. His private after-parties are well documented, and they were epic. Not because there was heavy drinking or drug use, I never saw Prince take a drink in my presence, but because he loved being the host and DJ. Looking back, I'm convinced he loved entertaining people whether he was on stage or off. I worked several events for politicians, most of which were not memorable. Whether it was people trying to run for the Senate or making an early splash in the presidential cycle, most were aloof and rude. It's probably not their fault, as they are surrounded by staff and their assigned security. However, they are also at these events to meet influential donors, creating a bad mix of politicians and those paying for influence. However, Clint Eastwood was an outlier among politicians at that time. He was pure joy to work for. In the early to mid-1990s, I would pick him up solo from a residence in Carmel and then drive him to his event. These events were always the same. A mix of local and state politicians and business leaders. resembling a fancy chamber of commerce meeting with finger foods and plenty of wine. But Clint was not a wine drinker. After I got him into the event, he would say, "How about we grab a beer?" That was my cue. I would jump back into the car and pull out a six-pack of Heineken that I had already packed in my cooler. Clint didn't want to be rude around all the stuffy people drinking wine while he was empty-handed. He typically drank 2 beers while listening to men and women in dark suits drone on and on. After an hour or two of short speeches and more glad-handing, I would take him back home and drink the leftover beers. Good times. Story 13. Tommy Wiseau. The most bizarre thing was that 20 years after the release of The Room, he looked exactly the same. Story 14. Met, as in standing 2 meters away from them but didn't talk to each other. Then most of the British royal family, Elizabeth II, Charles, Andrew, and some of the children. I saw them in Scotland about 20 years ago while visiting a church near Balmoral Castle. As for talking, I interacted with some actors, Edward James Olmos, Mary McDonnell, William Shatner, Patrick Stewart, and Scott Bakula, among others. I did some online journalism and had many interviews with science fiction personalities. Story 15. I met Bryan Cranston at a fair in 2008 or 2009. It was during the first or second season of Breaking Bad, and I recognized him from my favorite show, Malcolm in the Middle. He was really cool and nice, seemed very relaxed. I also met Jamal Wilkes, a former National Basketball Association player who won multiple championships with the Los Angeles Lakers in the 1980s. He is a Hall of Famer, and his jersey was retired by the Lakers. He was also a really cool and laid-back guy. Story 16. I met Gene Hackman while working on a small motor yacht in Florida in the late 1990s. We were in a shipyard, and he was looking at another yacht. Then he came over to check out our boat from the dock, which was about 75 feet long. The captain invited him aboard, and he gratefully accepted. His wife was with him as well, and he seemed to prefer our boat. I also carried a demo tape for Deep Purple when I was a motorcycle courier in London in 1987. I had a chat with them before I left, and they were quite laid-back and friendly. Story 17. Jack White rented the roller rink where I worked for Renee Zellweger's birthday. He bought all of us underage workers a few pitchers of beer as a thank you. The owner took them back, of course, but it was a nice gesture. Story 18. I am a chauffeur, and I drive many celebrities. Here are a few. Dave Matthews Band, Martin Short, Disturbed, John Mayer, Kane Brown, Ashanti, Aries Spears, John Wall, Michelle Wee, and others I may be forgetting. Story 19. Pharrell lived in the same building as I did in Miami for years. He was a really good guy, and I ran into him often. As a child, I also met Will Smith, who was not very nice, and Martin Lawrence, who was very kind and apologized for Will Smith's behavior towards me. Story 20. The Queen is lifting some weight, to be fair. She opened a new wing of our school back in the 1990s, and I was chosen as part of a small group to meet her. She asked if I enjoyed school, to which I, of course, replied that I did. I didn't. I really hated it, but she has a castle to accommodate people like me. Story 21. The late Gene Hackman, while I was an extra on the set of Hoosiers, was reportedly difficult for the director but extraordinarily nice to the hundreds of us packing the old gym in rural Indiana. He allowed us to approach him for pictures and handshakes. My mother was seated behind him in the stands, and he was sweet to her throughout the week. He even put her in charge of guarding his jacket, which he draped on his chair between takes. He seemed more connected to us than the film crew, which, from what I have read about him, appears to have been genuine. Story 22. I can't say I met him, but I did see Matthew McConaughey high and dancing to Gomez at the Austin City Limits Music Festival one year. I got Alan Rickman to sign my playbill when I saw him in the play Seminar in New York City. A little boy was walking by with his parents and stopped in his tracks when he saw him. The boy was wearing a Harry Potter scarf. Alan Rickman was kind enough to stop signing autographs to talk to the boy. Story 23. I work in the industry and have met many famous people. However, the most undeniably charismatic, compelling, and kind individual was Dolly Parton. Story 24. Weird Al by the buses after one of his concerts. He was extremely friendly, taking photos and signing autographs for everyone. Story 25. Steven Spielberg, in 1997, was shooting Amistad in a reconstructed pioneer village called Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. I was a French high school student and among the lucky ones in my school who took a trip to the United States. We were 15 and he was a legendary figure in Hollywood for us. He was very nice, stopped to chat with us for a minute, and even spoke a little French. It's a great memory to have. Story 26. I was waiting to cross the street one day in Detroit and realized I was standing next to Aretha Franklin. Story 27. Simon Pegg, Nick Frost, Martin Freeman, and Edgar Wright are delightful. I was an extra in all 3 movies of the Cornetto trilogy: Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End. Simon Pegg was lovely in Shaun of the Dead, but became progressively more reserved as he gained fame. He wasn't horrible, just more distant. I also met Ridley Scott while working in special effects on the set of the movie Nostradamus in the 1990s. It was directed by Roger Christian, who was Scott's art director on Alien. He was very supportive of a young person starting out in the film industry. Story 28. I was on a morning news show on the same day as Smokey Robinson. He was interested in what we were promoting, and I had a nice chat with him. We were with some teens who had no idea who he was. It was pleasant to have a conversation for a few minutes, like strangers making small talk, without anyone asking for autographs or pictures. One thing I love about New York is that most people know how to be cool, allowing for these moments. Story 29. My mom met Tupac when he came through her line at a grocery store back in 1995. She said he had his whole group with him and paid with a check. Story 30. Celine Dion. I am Quebecois, and we share a common friend. I met her a few times, and she sang at my friend's wedding but, unfortunately, couldn't stay for the after-party. She is funny, kind, and does not have an ego to match her success. She is down to earth, generous, and overall a lovely person from the little I got to know her. Story 31. Maya Angelou. I had just started working at a boutique hotel on Ocean Avenue in Santa Monica. The chef there, trying to impress me, kept telling me she was one of his regulars who came to the restaurant specifically for his food. I was thinking, yeah, okay, whatever. One night, about an hour before closing, this giant tour bus pulled up to the curb. I thought, this better not be like 50 people. But instead, the front desk receptionist came running into the restaurant and said, Mrs. Angelou has just arrived unannounced. Please prepare for her. I was the only server left on the floor, so she ended up being my table. She was incredibly kind, and when she asked me to bring the chef up, they immediately started chatting like old friends, even sharing a hug. They talked for a few minutes, and then she motioned for me to come back to the table, with the chef looking quite sheepish. She pointed her finger at me and said, Now, young lady, I hear this man has somewhat of a crush on you, and I highly suggest you go out on a date with him. I've had his food many times and can tell you, you won't regret his company. And you'd never have to cook a day in your life if you married him. Neither of us were expecting that, especially the chef. Apparently, he had bragged about her being his regular, but that I didn't believe him. She said, Well, let's change that, shall we? So anyway, I've been married to that guy for 13 years, and she was right. I never have to cook. Maya Angelou was my husband's wingman, and that's my claim to fame. We also had our wedding at Judith Krantz's house in Bel Air. My husband was doing private chef work on the side, and she was one of his clients. One of our very close friends was Judith's personal assistant, which is how he got the job. As soon as she heard of our engagement, on Christmas, no less, she called and offered to propose the idea to Judith. Judith invited all 3 of us over for dinner, prepared by my husband, and to take a tour of the house, which was immaculate. She offered up the guest house and backyard on the Bel Air golf course. No questions asked. She came to the wedding and everything. My grandmother was more excited about Judith than about my wedding. Story 32. I met Taylor Swift at a coffee shop in New York City in 2014. I was so nervous that I spilled my latte all over myself, but she just laughed and helped me clean up. She even gave me napkins from her purse. She is seriously the sweetest person ever. Story 33. Hank Aaron, Willie Ames, Mike Pence, and Lou Ferrigno. The most disappointing meeting was with Ferrigno, who was very standoffish. Story 34. Sat across from Spud Webb and Horace Grant on a Delta flight from McCoy to Atlanta. Sat next to Cal Ripken Jr. flying from Westchester to Chicago. Patrick Dempsey in the paddock at Daytona. Will Perdue at a basketball camp in Merritt Island. Pete Rose in Las Vegas. Story 35. Robin Williams. I spent extended periods of time with him on many occasions. You would think he would be an absolute joy to be around, given his public persona, but you would be wrong. He was even better. His surprise visits to San Ramon Valley High School in Danville, California, were legendary, as was the way he confronted the principal when he was rude to him about interrupting class. Story 36. Probably Rick Moranis somehow ended up in the same box seats as him at a Canadian Football League game. I have also met Teemu Selänne, but I guess that's more niche. Story 37. Bill Murray. I lived in Los Angeles in the early 1990s in a tiny studio apartment. Across the street was a convenience store where I would buy beer. One day after work, I went to the store and got some beer. Inside, also buying beer, was Bill Murray. He grabbed 2 very large bottles, walked to the window of the store, and gestured to his girlfriend or wife to see if the beer he had chosen was okay. She nodded. Then he gestured to see if she wanted 1 or 2 and walked to the cashier with 4 beers. I walked behind him with my own beer and mustered the nerve to say, "You, Lee Harvey," from Stripes. Without batting an eye, he turned to me and replied, "You're a madman," finishing the lines from the movie. It was my favorite film as a kid, and he was my favorite actor. I couldn't have been happier. Story 38. I was shopping in Water Tower Place, Chicago, in the late 1990s with my then-girlfriend, who was very strange when it came to interacting with other females. I saw Etta James across the store and began walking toward her, upsetting my girlfriend. I approached Etta and asked if she was Etta James. She said yes, and then I asked for a hug. She obliged, smelling heavenly, like a candy dish overflowing with sweets. When I returned to my girlfriend, she threw a fit. I had just met Etta James, and my girlfriend was mad at me. That was our last date, and I hugged Etta James. Story 39. I saw Michael Stipe in a bar one time in the 2000s. I walked straight up to him and said, "Jack White, how are you?" We then had a 15-minute conversation about the White Stripes, with Michael pretending to be Jack White. I would do it again. Story 40. Henry Winkler is hands down the nicest person I have ever met. He was on stage talking about his life, and afterwards he waited in the foyer, taking individual photos with every single person. There must have been a few thousand attendees. I was second to last, and he had been taking photos for about 2 hours. His team had a speedy and efficient process in place, making it quick when you actually got close in line. However, the lady in front of me was behaving poorly and taking up too much time. She wanted to take more and more photos and show Henry all the posters she had brought with her. Eventually, the handlers called security, and the woman threw a tantrum on the floor. Henry stood perfectly still while this escalated, and we exchanged glances, both wondering what was going on. At this point, I expected him to be exhausted and ready to be done with everything. But instead, he greeted me warmly, thanking me for coming to his show and for waiting for him. I stood shoulder to shoulder, trying not to touch him, but he wrapped his arm around me and pulled me in close. Felt like taking a photo with a close relative or friend. When we finished, he thanked me again for coming out, as if I were doing him a favor. He is just a genuinely nice man, sincere and kind. Story 41. I spent some time with Pamela Anderson because my friend was married to her for a brief period. She is a wonderful person. While cleaning out her wardrobe, she generously gave my daughter thousands of dollars worth of expensive clothing, and they happened to be the same size in everything. Story 42. Prince Philip at St. James Palace. I remember the staff telling us that we were one of the last groups, and he liked to chat and wasn't overly concerned about the time allocated. The time given for his arrival was merely advisory. You can't really hurry someone along too forcefully when their wife is the queen. One of the staff quipped, "The prince is never late. He arrives precisely when he means to." Either everyone else in the room was very nervous, or I was the only one who got the reference because I chuckled quietly, only to realize I was the only one who reacted. Story 43. Prince Harry in a pub took time to say hello to everyone and shake hands. David Beckham at an event only had a few minutes, but as a childhood hero of mine, it meant a lot. Story 44. I was walking through San Francisco airport years ago when a security guard stopped me and said, "I need you to wait here for a moment." So I waited for a few seconds. Then the Dalai Lama came out of a door leading to a security room a few feet away, looking exactly like he does in pictures. I gave him a little wave as he passed, and he nodded and smiled back. He left the terminal and got into a large black SUV and was gone. Story 45. Tony Hawk. I was skateboarding in the morning before going to work. He was being filmed for a commercial at the skate park I was at in Venice Beach in 2005. It looked like he finished filming and started skateboarding with us. I was so excited. We asked him, "Why do you always wear a helmet?" He said that sponsors make him do it. I will never forget that day. He's really cool. Story 46. I saw Bernie Sanders strolling through Bryant Park one time. I was getting ready for my shift. We locked eyes, exchanged a subtle greeting, and continued on our way. It was a cool moment. Story 47. O.J. Simpson. I got my picture with him in Aruba when I was 18. He invited me to have a drink with his entourage. I sat there for about 10 minutes having a drink until someone else asked him for a photo, to which he obliged. The guy then turned to his friend and said, "I'm getting my picture with a famous murderer." Needless to say, O.J. flipped out and they started arguing about whether or not he killed his wife. He said, "Every bruise on her body was for me, but I didn't kill her." I chugged my drink and left. Another time in Aruba, I met Natalie Holloway's mother looking for her. I got an interview with her for my parents' small local New Jersey paper. That night, I went to Carlos and Charlie's with a group of people I knew from the hotel who stayed at the same time as us every year. Urine Vanderslut tried hitting on one of those girls that night. I told her to leave and we all left. Story 48. Prince William. I have also seen Queen Elizabeth II up close and spoke to her, but she just nodded and smiled, so I don't know if that counts as meeting. Story 49. Val Kilmer is a fan of my small western town. He has visited many times over the years, and I have met him twice. He is a nice man. Story 50. George Harrison, Mike McCartney, Eric Clapton, Ted Turner, former member of Wishbone Ash, Maureen Starkey, Desmond Morris. Story 51. John Lithgow, probably around 1990 or 1991. I was about 13 or 14 years old. He was sitting right across the aisle from me during a flight. He was very nice, but his wife at the time was not. As we were getting off the plane, I heard her tell him, "This is the last time we're ever flying coach again." He did get mobbed for autographs throughout the flight, but he was smiling the entire time while his wife glared at everyone and shook her head. She was not happy about it. I chatted with him for a couple of minutes about Harry and the Hendersons after saying, "Hey, aren't you the guy from Harry and the Hendersons?" He laughed and replied, "Yes, I am." I left him alone for the rest of the flight. It made me realize how difficult it must be to be famous, with people constantly wanting to talk to you, take pictures with you, or get your autograph. But the way I see it, it comes with the territory. You can either grin and bear it or be known as an unpleasant famous person. I've seen several famous people since then, but I have never approached any of them and never will. Story 52. Woody Harrelson was waiting for a table in Asheville, North Carolina, in early September 2011. He liked our baby and was very nice. He was there for the filming of one of the Hunger Games movies, which felt a bit surreal. Story 53. R. Lee Ermey. He was doing a meet and greet. My husband and I stood in line for approximately 3 hours to meet him. Story 54. I had an actual conversation with Bruce Campbell for more than 5 minutes. I met Chester Bennington and was able to talk for a couple of minutes and shake hands. Story 55. Carrie Von Erich. It was a public autograph signing, so I didn't just run into him on the street. But I was like, "Wow, you're on TV." Story 56. I met Larry King twice on different occasions a couple of weeks apart because I did technical work at two venues where he was speaking as part of a book tour. I got to speak with him briefly each time while we were passing time. He was very nice to me, and we cracked a couple of jokes back and forth. Each time, he remarked, "All this fuss for little old me? Just a scrawny Jewish public school kid from Brooklyn." It was true, he was scrawny. He had an unusual appearance with odd proportions, sort of like Kermit the Frog with tiny legs. He didn't quite look structurally sound. The second time I met him, I said, "I was just with you a few weeks ago at the previous venue." He responded, "How did I do?" I replied, "I think you gave the people what they wanted." He said, "I don't know. I felt odd that night." He went on to mention something specific that I remembered him saying on stage, something minor but derogatory about someone who had treated him badly in the past. I don't recall the details now. It was something about a cable executive. I shouldn't have said that. He was a wonderful man. He did a lot for me. I shouldn't have brought that up for a laugh. It really struck me that Larry, who was in his late 70s, would be so hard on himself over something like that from weeks ago that he would bring it up to a stranger putting a microphone on him in the back of a theater. People are just people when you give them space to be. Story 57. Taylor Swift was an up-and-coming country music star and had not yet gone completely mainstream. Story 58. I have worked in security for my entire career. People I have met include Muhammad Ali, Howard Stern, Charlie Sheen, Drew Carey, Colin Powell, Shaquille O'Neal, Dennis Rodman, Scottie Pippen, Madonna, Bryan Cranston, and several others. I would have done almost anything to meet Ali in his prime. Sheen was always spoiled and sarcastic. I know it sounds shocking. He is the same guy from 2.5 Men, but not nearly as smooth without the writers feeding him lines. Drew Carey, Howard Stern, and Shaquille O'Neal were some of the nicest, down-to-earth people I have ever met. When Cranston found out I had struggled with cancer, he seemed sincerely concerned. Either that or he is an exceptional actor. The time and interest Cranston showed in me is something I will not forget. Story 59. I met Chris Evans once in a downtown nook of Atlanta. He had a beard, so it didn't click right away. This was before the premiere of Avengers Endgame. It was raining, and I went out to have a cigarette. I started talking with my friend's wife, and I stopped her to ask if she thought that was Chris Evans. Her eyes went wide, and she couldn't speak, so I walked over. It was one of those nights where it started raining out of the blue, and me and maybe 8 other people, were already at the bar, so we decided to stay for a bit. He was talking to 2 friends, and I felt bad for interrupting, but I figured, why not? I said, "Hey, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to invite you guys to come hang out. We're a good group of people. I'm Hapafit Buddha." I stuck out my hand. He shook it and said, "Hey, I'm Chris." I replied, "Yeah, I know. Anyway, come over, and we'll buy you guys a beer." Then I walked back, and my friend's wife was still in shock. I told her to be cool and that I invited them over. We walked back to our group, and about 5 minutes later, they came over and hung out for about an hour. It had been a long day of day drinking, so other than myself and my friend's wife, no one recognized him. I was away when he came over and apparently introduced himself as my friend. One of my buddies was arguing with him over the definition of a sweatshirt when there's a hoodie attached. It's a hoodie, by the way. Long story short, we had some drinks, and he left when the rain let up. He then came back, made sure to shake everyone's hand, and said a kind word. After he was long gone, I turned to the group and asked, "You all know who that was?" They looked at me, confused, and said, "Huh? Your buddy, Chris." And my friend's wife shouted, "Captain America." The glass shattered, and they were floored. I'll never forget it. Just a great guy all around. Also, when I tell the story, I refer to him as my buddy Chris. I feel like he'd be cool with it. Story 60. I ran into Taylor Swift at a small coffee shop in New York City back in 2014. She was so down to earth and even complimented my scarf. The funny part was that I was actually wearing one of her merchandise scarves and completely forgot about it. She laughed and said, "Great taste." Story 61. Nemo, who is not the fish, won the Eurovision Song Contest last year. I went to kindergarten and primary school with them. Additionally, my brother's first kiss was with Nemo's sister. Story 62. Cillian Murphy for 2 minutes. I have followed his career since 28 Days Later and Sunshine. Not only is he a great actor, but he also has that old Hollywood mystique where he performs his job and then goes home. Story 63. Hulk Hogan at a hockey game, I guess. But my favorite encounter, even though he is not as famous anymore, was meeting Tim Tebow at the hospital when my mom was just admitted. He talked to me for about half an hour and really helped calm me down. Story 64. Russ Grimm of the Washington Redskins, Mike Webster in the early 1980s, Monica Lewinsky, Steve Forbes, and Big John Studd, whose son was in my son's Cub Scout troop. Many World Wrestling Federation wrestlers when I worked at a law firm in Washington, D.C. The actor Fred Thompson, for whom I filled in as secretary when I worked at the same law firm. Greaseman and Howard Stern when they were on the radio in Washington, D.C. John Denver, the Statler Brothers, and the Oak Ridge Boys. Franco Harris, Mean Joe Green, Terry Bradshaw, Ricky Blyer, Dan Marino, Mel Blount, and some other Pittsburgh Steelers when I attended L.C. Greenwood's funeral. Story 65. My little sister used to babysit Michael Phelps. Whitney Phelps was in her grade. I have never met him as an adult, though. That kid is super famous. He is a household name in places that do not watch television. Story 66. I bumped into David Harbour at a boxing match at the O2 in London a few years ago. He was with his now wife Lily Allen, just before the news broke that they were dating, and I did not recognize her at all. Story 67. Henry Rollins during one of his spoken word tours hung around outside his bus afterward, answering questions, signing autographs, and taking pictures. He was very relaxed and stayed until everyone was satisfied. Story 68. Adam West, the original Batman, starred in the mid to late 1960s. Buck Berry, a singing cowboy, was active a bit earlier. Story 69. Pete Seeger, perhaps. I had dinner last year with Ayrton Senna's son, Bruno. In another instance, a bodyguard of Jerry Adams from Sinn Féin threatened to shoot me. Story 70. It is a toss-up between Michael Jordan, who dealt blackjack to me, and Bill Clinton, who had a neighbor that was a Secret Service agent and brought my family to a meet and greet shortly after he was elected president. Story 71. Ray Liotta, rest in peace. He starred in a soap opera in the early 1980s that was filmed down the block from where I lived. He was stunning in person. Story 72. Adam Sandler was a regular at a restaurant where I used to work. He was down to earth, nice, and an absolutely normal person. On my first day as a host, he came in dressed in his classic basketball shorts and told me that I was so handsome I was making him look bad, while I was wearing essentially a suit. Story 73. Bill Burr at a table read for F is for Family. It was just a quick hello since I taught his co-star's child. I love that guy. Story 74. Paul McCartney and Donald Trump with his then wife Marla Maples. I would like to think that Paul McCartney is more famous, but I am not really sure. Story 75. I met Corey Feldman at Mel's Drive-In on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood. I was outside smoking a cigarette when he came out to smoke as well. We talked about the different music clubs in the area. He was cool. I also met Marilyn Chambers, the adult film star. I was 18 and used a fake ID to get into a strip club where she was performing. She allowed you to take a Polaroid picture with her for $20. I took the picture with her and she was topless in the photo. Unfortunately, I lost the picture a long time ago. Story 76. Howie Mandel. I was friends with his nephew in elementary school, and he was usually at his birthday parties. Story 77. In person, Tom Brady at a signing at Gillette Stadium, chatting through direct messages, Bryson Tiller about video games. Story 78. David Bowie in the late 1990s at San Francisco Airport was super soft-spoken and as cool as you would expect. Story 79. Anibal Acevedo Vila during his governorship in Puerto Rico gave me an unprompted handshake. I didn't even know who he was. It was during a Christmas event when I was a child, so I had no clue until my dad told me. Carlos Delgado, a famous Puerto Rican baseball player, was tall and attractive. He seemed much taller than me and had perfect teeth and a perfectly groomed beard. Yvonne Calderon, a Puerto Rican flyweight boxer, also gave me an unprompted handshake after my dad asked for a picture while we were hanging out in the old city of San Juan. He was shorter than I expected. His hands were veiny and muscular, and his grip during the handshake was impressive. Story 80, Jim Varney. I didn't talk to him much, but he lived in our small town, and I would see him around. It was really sad when he passed. Story 81, Yogi Berra lived in my hometown and was close friends with my grandparents. His wife, Carmen, hosted my mother's wedding shower. Growing up, I knew he was famous, but it wasn't until I immersed myself in Yankees history that I realized what a legend he was. Story 82. I cannot claim to have met him face to face, but Roald Dahl came to my school in the 1980s. He was an eccentric, somewhat cantankerous character. Initially, he only wanted to talk to the senior years until my headmistress persuaded him to allow the whole school to attend. He refused to sign autographs for the students and became grumpy when we laughed too much at one of his jokes. All that may sound like I am criticizing him. I am not, although I admit to being disappointed at the time. My perspective has changed with age and maturity. He was, and remains, one of my favorite authors, and he had a reputation for being notoriously prickly during his life, so he was simply being himself. Additionally, he was in his 70s and just 2 years away from dying from cancer, so I understand that his health was not the best. I can empathize with him not wanting to personally deal with a group of noisy schoolchildren and going through the tedious process of signing all those books and answering any questions we might have. His address to our assembly was genuinely funny and engaging, and it was a tremendous honor to see him in person. I also have a very special memory. For some reason, he had to come through the hallway where our classroom was located on the way to a meeting with our headmistress. Our class saw him walking by, and we waved at him. He smiled and waved back. That memory will always hold a cherished place in my heart. Story 83. Not the most famous, but one of my favorites is Bob Costas. I worked with him a couple of times. His ability to remember people's names and engage in genuine conversations with respect for everyone, even someone like me fetching his coffee, makes me respect him immensely as an all-around professional, even when there are no cameras present. Story 84. Kevin Smith, Jason Mewes, Mean Joe Green, Sammy Hagar, Clyde Drexler, and Earl Campbell are all pretty cool. Story 85. That's tough. I worked at a restaurant in New York City that was a haven for celebrities. I met Bill Clinton, so I guess that's the most famous, but I also served George Clooney, Madonna, and Matt Damon, among others. Story 86. Mick Foley. At the Akron airport, I had just turned 21, and he let me buy him a beer. Monday Night Raw was the previous night in Cleveland, and he was flying somewhere. We chatted for 10 to 15 minutes. Story 87. Gene Shalit. I know many will not recognize the name, but around 1995, he was one of the most recognizable faces in America. Story 88. I have met and fed many famous people, so I looked up lists of the most famous individuals in the United States. The highest profile person I have met is Tom Hanks. He was delightful. Story 89. I asked Paul McCartney for directions outside Madison Square Garden in New York City and talked to Yogi Berra on the phone. Story 90. Tom Felton is such a kind and humble man. I worked at Lush at the time and helped him choose a bath bomb and a moisturizer. That is a precious memory. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.